Sunday school.
All right, so now we are recording, just so you guys know. Be careful what you say. We'll wait another minute or two.
We got the Hermans. Not sure
Yeah.
which ones, because they're
I know Brooks for
It's
sure. I don't know if Joanna's there too.
Both Hermans are here.
All right.
oh, the Hermans are in the house. What about Ermin though? Where's Papa Ermin?
I don't know where the Hermans are.
I think my mom had book club.
Book club.
Okay.
All right.
This is a different kind of book club.
For sure. For
That's a
sure.
good one.
A different kind of book club. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. All right. Well, I'm going to have to make sure that my artwork transfers over. I'm sorry that you didn't see. I had a nice, beautiful picture next to the book of Daniel, but I did this on my computer at home, and I guess it didn't transfer over to my computer at the office. But we are studying the book of Daniel over the next 5 weeks. It is, as I said earlier, a book that we don't normally study. It's actually studied quite a bit in Christianity, and we're going to see why by the end of this course. It is in the Christian Bible in different places, actually, from where it is in the Jewish Tanakh and the Jewish Bible. And hang on, I'm going to just mute everybody so we don't get all the background. There we go. And what we want to do today, and we're going to go through a syllabus in a second, but my goal is, first of all, to familiarize us with this book, to look at some of the stories, and try to derive out of it some of the themes that traditional Judaism has learned from this particular book. And we're going to see it actually is a very important book for the transition between a temple religion to the rabbinic religion that's going to come afterwards. This book is very important for that transition. So let's talk about what we're going to do here. In terms of our syllabus today, we're going to kind of get our feet wet, an introduction, a little bit of history, learn about the structure of the book of Daniel. Then we're going to spend 2 weeks really diving into the text. It's a pretty long book, and so I encourage you to read it beginning to end. That's not what we're going to do in this class. We're actually going to highlight and focus on very particular parts of it that I want to talk about. But I do encourage you to read it beginning to end. For those who are fluent in Hebrew and who normally read the biblical books in Hebrew, my apologies. As we're going to see, a great deal of this book is actually in Aramaic. It's split between Hebrew and Aramaic, which also talks about when it was written, or shows us when it was written. And so it's a little bit more complicated to understand it than it is for those who are familiar with Hebrew. So 2 weeks, we're going to really dive into the text. Then on February 15th, we're going to really look at the difference between the way that the Christian world views the book of Daniel and the way the Jewish world views the book of Daniel. Specifically, as we're going to see a little bit later on, there were additions in the Septuagint, in the Greek text, that we don't have in the Jewish biblical, in Jewish Hebrew and Aramaic texts at all. There are 3 different sections that were added in, and we'll talk about those particular sections as we go through. And certainly we're going to see the book of Daniel is really one of the books that is used to foretell the coming of Jesus. Obviously, that's going to be a big difference between the way that the Christian world looks at the book of Daniel and the way that the Jewish world looks at the book of Daniel. So we're going to spend an entire hour delving into that. And then, as I always like to do, we'll bring it back. We'll look at the themes, kind of draw our conclusions and try to ask ourselves, so what do we learn, right? How do we as modern Jews now move forward in the world, having been exposed to this book of Daniel? That's the overall syllabus that we're going to look at. It's 5 classes. We'll end by the end of February. And I will record them as long as Diana reminds me each time, because I tend to forget. I will record them so
when's the final exam?
Right. So that if you miss one, you can email me and I will try to get you a link of the recording as we go.
Do you want me to post the link to Safaria? Is that a good, you like that?
I'm going to actually talk, I'm going to show that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you can do the specific one to Daniel.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to do. I have it ready. So
yeah, good. So that actually then answers the question, where do I find this book of Daniel? Right. Oh, see, it didn't bring the video. All right, the picture. So there was supposed to be next to Safaria.org a picture of the Tanakh, which is the JPS, Jewish Publication Society's version of the Hebrew Bible translated into English. It is the one that I recommend. It is spelled Tanakh, and I like it because it takes a fairly literalist view of the text, right? Some translations can get very figurative and interpretive. It takes a fairly literalist view, and it's in modern English. No these, thous, thys, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's one of them right there. The one Elisheva is showing right now is actually, hold on, I will let everybody see you. The one Elisheva is showing is actually the Hebrew English version. There's another one which is just English, and that works too, whichever you're more familiar with. The other option is Safaria, which the website is there, and Diana is going to post the specific link in the chat to Daniel itself, the book of Daniel, and you can use that. It'll have Hebrew and English and commentaries if you want to look at that as well. Let's talk about the history of the book of Daniel. Daniel is part of the 3rd section of the Tanakh of the Hebrew Bible, the first being the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the second being the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the third being the Ketuvim, the writings. It is in this 3rd section, Ketuvim, that we find the book of Daniel in the Tanakh. However, if you're looking at the Christian Bibles, especially the Catholic Bible, they actually put the book of Daniel in the section of the prophets, in the 2nd section, right? And more specifically, in the section of the major prophets, with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, right? The biggies. The Christians will put Daniel in that section. It is a relatively late work from the 2nd century CE, right? CE. So that is about the time that the Mishnah was being written, about the time that the rabbis were teaching. Fairly late when it comes to biblical. It is one of the latest biblical texts that we have. Hence the Aramaic, because that was what they were speaking at the time. Tom says I have the Stone edition. The Stone edition works well too. Yeah, that works fine. So it is written fairly late, although it tries, and we're going to see that today when we look at the 1st chapter, it tries to appear as though it is a 6th century BCE document. So that is 8 centuries, give or take, right? 2nd century Common Era, pretending to be a document from 800 years prior or so. What's its structure? Chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. Chapter 1, 8 and 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew. The first part, chapters 1 through 6, are what most scholars call the tales. They're stories, a lot of prose. And then the second part, chapters 7 through 12, are what we call the visions, much more what we would see as classical prophetic literature. And then, as I mentioned before, we have a third part, which are the Christian editions that we find in the Septuagint, right, in the Greek text. And there are three different editions. One, which is called the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children. The second, which is called Susanna and the Elders. And the third, which is called Bel and the Dragon. And again, these are sections that appear in the Christian text, do not appear at all in the Jewish text. And you could say, well, maybe they fell out of the Jewish text. So the good news is when it comes to Jewish texts, we actually are able to trace back a lot of these documents to very early literature with the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other literature that's there. None of these appear in any Jewish literature anywhere. And so most scholars will believe, or do believe, that these are later additions in the Septuagint text that the Christian world added in. Yeah, and Bob is correct. There's a chapter 13, which is Catholic, and the Protestant actually text doesn't have that either. Any questions sort of about the overarching structure? Because we're going to get a little bit more specific in a second.
Why would they switch between different languages?
It's a really good question, Alex. What it probably means is that there were two different parts of this book that were written at different times or by different authors that were brought together.
Any idea what was first?
Hebrew is usually first, and Aramaic is usually latter, but not always. So we don't really know. And I in my research, I didn't find much to say about the dating of it other than it was 2nd century. So by a show of hands, for those people who know, how many people have heard the word chiasm or chiastic structure? Anybody know what that means? Other than probably Brooks. So a chiastic structure is a literary structure. Yeah, Diana, do that again.
Isn't it sort of like it goes like it builds on each other or something?
Yeah,
and then
it's
it
sort of an inverted pyramid, right?
like a pyramid. Yeah.
Yeah. It's A, B, B, A.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of doing that.
Right? That's what a chiastic structure is. And we see that in a lot of biblical books. We see that in Psalms a lot. We see that in a number of different biblical books. And what's interesting is that the structure of certainly the Aramaic section is chiastic. And it's a little bit more complex than just A, B, B, A. It's actually A, B, C, C, B, A is how it's built. So what does that look like? And I'm going to give you just sort of the general idea so that we can watch for it. The first section, which starts really in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is an intro, and it's not Aramaic, as we said earlier. Talks about this dream of 4 kings being replaced by a 5th king. Then we move into the story of Daniel's friends and the fiery furnace, something that we're going to look at. Then we see Daniel interpreting a dream for the king Nebuchadnezzar. Then we see Daniel interpreting the handwriting for another sort of ruler, Belshazzar. Then we get the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And finally, we have a vision of 4 world kingdoms being replaced by a 5th. Does everyone see the parallelism here? Right? A1 and A2, the visions of 4 being replaced by a 5th, very parallel. B1 and B2 are this risk of death and being saved, right? The fiery furnace and the lion's den. And finally, this interpreting of a message in the middle, in the C section, right? When we find literature like this, what we know, or what we note, is a lot of thought has been put into this particular document. This wasn't just somebody writing off the top of their head and, associatively, right? This was a carefully crafted document, a carefully crafted piece of literature that is trying to give us a message. And as a rabbi, I love seeing this, because what it means is there's something to be found here, right? And we get to think about, well, what is the author trying to tell us through all of this, through the structure, through the word choice, through the meaning, all of those sorts of things. There's so much to be found here. Any questions on this? All right. So what are some of the themes, right, that we are going to learn from the book of Daniel? And I want to give us to them sort of in the beginning, so we can think about it as we're reading through, and then we'll, at the conclusion, hopefully be able to wrap back up and come back to these themes. First, right, if we're talking about the role of the book of Daniel in Jewish tradition, there are a couple of ideas that I think that are really important. Number one, it's the conversion to a post-temple religion. We see that hidden throughout, even though this is pretending to be a document that is still in the time of the temple, right? And we're going to find out that it's actually at that moment of the destruction, of when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And that's what gives us the ability to say, oh, well, what happens when we don't have a temple? In the real world, when this was being written in the 2nd century CE, the temple was already destroyed. There is no temple. The second temple was destroyed. And so that it's going to give us a voice that was set in a different time, but speaks to the people that are right then and there, of saying, we have this world without the temple. How do we be Jews? The second we're going to see is a shift from this idea of sort of a state religion, i.e. the Kohanim, the priesthood, the temples, to an individual belief system, right? It's no longer everybody comes together on these 3 pilgrimage festivals, and that's how we celebrate. But it's each and every one of us is going to be able to study Torah, is going to be able to learn, it's going to be able to have a relationship with God, right? All those things that we now know Rabbinic Judaism picked up and really carried for us. We start to see that in the book of Daniel. We definitely see a theme throughout the book of Daniel of the supremacy of God. Right? God is definitely a number one. And this is important because, again, the temple's not there anymore. It was just destroyed. The setting is back in the Babylonian exile. So it was a time, ostensibly, in the narrative of the story, when people could lose their faith. Where's God? God has abandoned us. The Babylonians have come, they've destroyed our temple, and now we are in exile. But this is a story of the supremacy of God throughout all of that. And more specifically, we're going to see a very clear rejection of paganism and this idea of coexisting gods, a reaffirmation of monotheism. we're going to see this, and we've sort of mentioned this a little bit already, that ultimately the book of Daniel is going to kind of be a guide for Judaism in exile, right? It happened, it was, the setting is of the story is earlier, but the same thing's happening now. So how do we do that? And finally, we're going to really look into the differences between the Jewish and Christian understandings of Daniel. So these are the themes that we're going to be looking at and we're going to be talking about throughout. Questions? All right. Diana, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. It's sort of hard for me like to put everything chronologically. And I know like there's mention of Achashverosh in Daniel. And like when we get to that part, like will you be able to sort of tie it together, like because Purim's coming up and all that stuff, or is that like too far afield? Because I know there's like this connection and it's a little fuzzy.
Look, there is a religious connection. I don't know it well. I'll try to look into it as Purim's coming up. But the reality is, this is, you know, we have what are called, you know, like pseudepigraphic works, which is a work that is pretending to be a work of another author.
Yeah.
We also have works that pretend to be at different times, written at different times from when they were actually written. And because this is one of those works, it's hard to make that historical connection.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because I know in Megillah, in Masechet Megillah, they talk a lot about these stories and Daniel's friends. I'm not, no spoilers here, and Darius and like all the players that were reading in Daniel. And I'm like, oh, so that was, anyway, that's another conversation. It's just confusing.
So yeah, what I'll say from a historical perspective, right? I'm going to take off my religious hat, put on a historian's hat for a moment. What I'm going to say is 800 years later, Persian history was a little fuzzy. And so the authors of the book of Daniel had to put in what they knew about Persian history. And it wasn't always quite accurate to what was really going on at that time.
Yeah, that helps, because they say like Vashti was Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter. It's like, and I'm doing this now going, wait, this isn't, anyway. Okay, thank you.
No, doesn't really work. Yeah. Okay. So let's dig into some text, right? What I want to do before we leave today is we're going to go through the first chapter of the book of Daniel, which is really the introduction, and get a sense of how it's being framed. See some of these things in terms of when it pretends to be from and all that kind of stuff, and just get a flavor of it before we go into the sort of the highlights of Daniel in the next 2 weeks. So we're going to start with chapter 1. I'm going to read just because it's a little bit easier, I think, then I don't have to put people on the spot as we go through, but follow along with me as we go. In the third year, they're also really hard names. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord delivered King Jehoiakim of Judah into his power, together with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. He deposited the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king then ordered Ashpenaz, his chief officer, to bring some Israelites of royal descent and of the nobility, youths without blemish, handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable, intelligent, and capable of serving in the royal palace, and teach them the writings and language of the Chaldeans. The king allotted daily rations to them from the king's own food and from the wine he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's service. Among them were the Judahites Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officer gave them new names. Daniel he named Belteshazzar, Hananiah Shadrach, Mishael Meshach, and Azariah Abednego. All right, so this already, like we could spend hours digging into this. There's so much richness here, okay? It gives us a time frame of when this purports to be. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Babylon. When is that? That is in the year 586 BCE, right? We know when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem. We know when the Babylonian exile began in 586 BCE. I'm going to switch over to my highlighter here. Okay, so the fact that it says here, Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it, then it goes on to say the temple was destroyed. It doesn't say that because Jewish texts actually hate to say that, but it says some of the vessels of the house of God were taken and brought into the land of Shinar. Well, that only happens when the temple is destroyed. Then it says he ordered Ashpenaz to bring Israelites of royal descent and nobility. So let's talk for a moment about the Babylonian exile, because a lot of people think they picked up all the Jews and took them all to Babylon. It's not what happened. That's actually not the way that the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the other nations created their empires. They did try and purposefully bring people from one area to another because they wanted to try to homogenize the empire, right? They wanted to try and have all people in different places, because if you still had a bunch of people in one place, you had all the Israelites in one place, and you didn't do that to them, they may decide to have a rebellion, right? Their leaders are there, they have this sense of patriotism, of whatever it is, they may create a rebellion. So what did the Babylonians do? They basically took the elite and the leadership, and they left the peasants and the farmers. Because for the most part, the peasants and the farmers can produce what they're going to do for anybody. And it was the leaders and the elite that ultimately was going to foment rebellion, right? As long as the peasants and the farmers had enough to eat, they would do their thing, and they didn't have this need for, national pride and all of that kind of stuff. They just were trying to survive day by day. It was the nobility, it was the leadership that was going to become trouble. And so they took them and they brought them to Babylon. It's also why we get, songs, by the waters of Babylon, I laid down and wept, right? Peasants aren't going to write that. They were illiterate. It was the literate elite that actually were there that were doing that. And so this is actually historically very accurate, because what it's saying here is they took some of them, they brought them there. And what was Nebuchadnezzar trying to do? He was trying to teach them about his ways and have them be part of the court. So now they were going to be just part of the overall empire. They were going to be part of his advisors. It makes a lot of sense. Okay. And the last part of this is, and we've seen this in a number of different places, when Israelites take positions of power, especially in the non-Jewish world, their name gets changed. We saw that with Joseph, right? In Egypt, his name got changed. We see it now here because these Jewish names aren't good. The king wants them to have Babylonian names. Questions or comments on this first part of the chapter? Okay, so this is really the intro and kind of gives us the historical basis for when this is supposedly happening and all of that. Now we actually get into the story. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank. So he sought permission of the chief officer not to defile himself. And God disposed the chief officer to be kind and compassionate to Daniel. In other words, they were serving treif, right? They were serving wine that was for idolatry, and he's not allowed to do that. Okay? We'll get back to that in a second. Keep that in your mind. The chief officer said to Daniel, I feared that my lord the king, who allotted food and drink to you, will notice that you look out of sorts, unlike the other youths your age, and you will put my life in jeopardy of the king, right? He's kind of going a little bit on a hunger strike here. He's not going to eat that stuff. He's not going to look like everybody else. Daniel replied to the guard with whom the chief officer had put in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, giving us legumes to eat and water to drink, kosher stuff. Then compare our appearance with that of the youths who eat the king's food, and do with your servants as you see fit. So feed us the kosher stuff, and let's see at the end of 10 days how we look. Now, what's interesting to me here is the laws of kashrut, as we know them, were not in place in the year 586 BC. Those are rabbinic laws. They were developed in the early part of the 1st and 2nd century CE. So the fact that this is an issue for Daniel is one of the things that proves this is a later source, because it wouldn't have been an issue for him in 586 BCE. Does everyone see that? So what we see is, and I don't know if it's the rabbis that wrote this per se, probably somebody or somebody of that group, but it's starting to bring out, we're starting to see post-temple rabbinic Judaism start to appear already from day one, from chapter 1 in the book of Daniel. All right, so Daniel says, don't worry, give us, all the legumes, the fava beans and all that kind of stuff, we'll be fine. What happens? So he agrees to this plan of theirs and tested them for 10 days. And when the 10 days were over, they looked better and healthier than all the youths who were eating the king's food. So the guard kept on removing their food and the wine they were supposed to drink and gave them the legumes. God made all 4 of these young men intelligent and proficient in all writings and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding of visions and dreams of all kinds. And when the time the king had set for the presentation had come, the chief officer presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. So this is 3 years later. The king spoke with them, and none of them all, and of all of them, none was equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these entered the king's service. Whenever the king put a question to them requiring wisdom and understanding, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and exorcists throughout his realm. Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. I believe, yeah, that's our introduction, okay? So we have this story set in the time of the Babylonian exile with a rabbinic flavor, with rabbinic feeling to it, and with the miracles of God, so to speak, that we would see in a biblical text. We kind of have this mishmash of all of these different things that are going on all at once, right? Biblical text feeling, rabbinic ideas set in a time that was a lot earlier than what's really going on. And it's setting up Daniel here to be, it's similar in some ways. And this is where I would agree, Diana, with what you were saying before. It's similar to the book of Esther in that we have a Jew, right? Or Jews, because there's 4 of them, sort of in power in this non-Jewish territory.
Yeah, with the food dilemma.
With a food dilemma, yeah.
Yay for vegans.
Okay. So I just want to pick up and just show that the rabbis, right, really just came in right after and highlighted this idea, quoted our particular section in Masechet Sanhedrin in the Talmud. 6 virtues were ascribed to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as it was written. Youth, and who was found no blemish, well-favored, skillful, discerning in knowledge, perceptive in understanding, and who had the strengths in them to stand in the king's palace, and who they might teach the learning in the tongues of the Chaldeans. Now, I actually count 7 here, and I'm not really sure how the rabbis got to 6, but they said 6.
Rabbi,
So, yes.
sorry, I mean, the authors of Daniel, I mean, they're kind of like pulling out of, the greatest hits of, of our, it's like the best of Joseph, the best of Modin on Daniel.
Yeah, so you were kind of breaking up a little bit. I don't know if that was me or if that was you, but what I heard was that there's sort of like a greatest hits mix of a lot of different things going on here. And I would say yes, because this is one of the latest books of the biblical canon or to be written. And therefore the rabbis had, and the authors had all the other books to kind of pull from as they were writing this. And so they were able to use those themes that they thought were apropos and most important. They were able to use those themes and bring them in. Rebecca.
Yeah, I have a question because you said that it was really written around the time of the rabbis. So it was somebody, I mean, they were sort of putting it in place to show like whatever they were trying to show of the people who had these great characteristics, and then they pulled it themselves and quoted from it, or was that later?
That was later. So
Okay.
the Talmudic quote was from the year probably 400 or 500.
Okay, a couple hundred years.
As
Okay.
opposed to the original, which was, it was earlier. But yes, I mean, they were using the book of Daniel as a biblical book to give guidance for the historical reality that they were facing in the 2nd century CE.
So when they put you mentioned about that the laws of kashrut weren't there. So did they do that purposefully, like they were trying to trick people, or they were just trying to set it up? I mean, did they know that people would know?
Those laws, I think that's just the way they were telling the story. Those laws were so much a part of the rabbinic mindset. I don't think that they could have gotten away with not doing that.
Like somebody writing a story about, 200 years ago and said they took out their pocket watch and they didn't have pocket watches or something, right?
Kind of.
Okay.
Kind of. It's not quite so anachronistic, but
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Rob.
This just shows my lack of knowledge here, but I thought the laws of kashrut were set forth in Leviticus, and therefore, when you said they wouldn't have been around at the time that this was set in, that just confused me. Am I just missing something there?
No, you are correct. So some of the laws of Leviticus were there in terms of what animals were permitted or not permitted. But for example, the laws about wine, right? Not being able to drink the wine is a much later law. And certainly the laws of how things are cooked and prepared and those sorts of things are much, much later. So some of the laws of kashrut, you're correct, are from Leviticus, but the rabbis were also coming at this once they added the wine in there, that was to tell that this was a little bit later.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Oh, Nancy has the picture that I had up earlier as our backdrop. Thank you, Nancy. That's the one here. I'll spotlight it for everyone. That's the one actually that I had on the first page. I'm not sure who did that, but that's the same one that I found.
Well, when I found it, it said it was British. Revere was the last name, I think, of the artist.
Okay. All right. So what do we learn, right? What's sort of our fundamental ideas for today? The book of Daniel is a hybrid book that mixes ideas from rabbinic periods with biblical periods. We see that in the nature between the Aramaic and the Hebrew. We also see this as this is going to be a tool that the rabbis are going to use instead of them just saying, all right, here's how to deal with exile, folks. Now they're going to be able to say, we have a prophet, we have a biblical book that can tell us how to deal with exile because we dealt with it before. Now, what's interesting is there are other prophets that wrote during the time of exile, Isaiah being one of them, right? Ezekiel being another one. And so those prophets are there as well, but because they were earlier biblical books, they didn't reflect the rabbinic world. They still reflected a biblical temple-based world. So the rabbis, if they wanted to reflect a rabbinic world, they had to create this book of Daniel to be able to do that. Any other questions on this?
When did the mixing of milk and meat, is that part of kashrut or Levitical?
So it is an interpretation. Yeah, it is an
Yeah.
interpretation of a biblical law. Do not boil
Yeah.
a kid in its mother's milk.
Right.
So it does not say anywhere in the Bible, do not mix milk and meat, but the rabbis have interpreted that law to mean do not mix milk and meat. So the milk and meat aspect is a combination. It's a rabbinic view of that verse, as opposed to what Rob Gans was saying before, which is, in Leviticus 11, it lists the permitted animals. Though that's clearly biblical, right? But
Right.
milk and meat and wine and those sorts of things are a later addition.
So like from 2000, I mean, the second century or the 200 AC?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first time we really see that is in the Mishnah and in the Midrash. So that's going to be, those sources were collected and taught between the years, I would say 0 to 200, give or take, right? Maybe a little before 0. But that first layer of rabbinic literature was completed about the year 200 by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. That's the Mishnah.
So do you think that it was actually practiced though further back, or that it was just written down at that time? Or
so the rabbis were already starting to teach rabbinic Judaism even while the temple was in existence. The rabbis were clearly there. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70, that is when rabbinic Judaism became all important, because there was no longer a temple at which to worship. And so they needed to have a shift from temple worship to another form of Judaism. And the rabbis were the only ones at the time that had a non-temple based focus. And what was their focus? Their focus was study of Torah, prayer, all the things that we now know today as being central parts of Judaism. It's because those were the things that could survive the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So rabbinic Judaism was already happening pre-70, but really became solidified and the only Judaism post-70. And especially post 134, 135, although the rabbis had already really kind of sort of taken over Judaism between 70 and 134, 135. But that was the Bar Kokhba revolt at that point in time. Tom and then Brooks.
I had a quick question. How did the rabbis disseminate their ideas to the broader Jewish community given, well, I mean, obviously, first of all, there wasn't a lot of literacy, so I assume rabbis sort of exchanged ideas with each other, but with everyone spread out in different areas in those days, how was that just, distributed, I guess?
So the same way I do every Saturday morning, they get up and they speak. And then what happens is somebody, who was in my congregation then goes to another congregation in LA and said, hey, I heard this great drush that this great thing that Rabbi Kornberg said and told them, and then that's how it got disseminated, right? It was an oral tradition, and the world was a lot smaller back then, Tom. I mean, you know, the land of Israel was pretty small, and the Babylonian Talmud and the Babylonian rabbis really didn't come into play until a little bit later. Most of this was really just centered in the land of Israel.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Brooks.
Hopefully I don't cut out here, but if you look up on Wikipedia, or if you Google, oh, my internet connection is unstable again.
We're hearing you.
Let me
Go ahead,
type my
Brooks.
question. Okay, if you Google or look up on Wikipedia and ask, when was the book of Daniel written? A lot of sources come back and say it was written in the 2nd century BC, not 2nd century CE. So it's actually pretty interesting to me, and it draws a lot on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it'd be hard to do if it was written at the same time. As it doesn't make sense. But it's interesting that there's a lot of conflicting information online about the authorship timeline of this.
Right. I mean, it's because it's kind of such an enigma. There are other works that are so easy to date because they have parallels with other works. They can use literary analysis to sort of say, oh, you know, this is how, you know, it's almost like saying, you know, if something is written in Old High English, you know, you can say it was probably written around the same time as some of these other major works, right? You know, Canterbury Tales or whatever were written, because that's just how they were writing and talking back then, as opposed to written now. It's so hard to do with the book of Daniel, and the Aramaic makes it even more difficult. But the Aramaic tends to date it later, because Aramaic wasn't the lingua franca in the 2nd century BCE, right? That really wasn't until later on. And so things that were written in the 2nd century BCE, that was all Hebrew. That was all being written in Hebrew.
What is the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls? So what's the difference between 200 AC and like the point of something being
So
in a
the Dead
Sea
Sea Scrolls, were written over a period of time, but the Dead Sea sect was in existence as the temple was being destroyed. One of the reasons why they hid
Okay.
out there, and in the kind of the 100 years before that. So
Oh, I
that's
see.
sort of 100 BCE through 100 CE. Kind of, that's the time of the ish.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
When was Aramaic the language of the land mostly?
So really and truly, Aramaic became the language, much more the language of the land, right? 200 to 500. So the
See.
Mishnah, for example, and the early Midrash that was written from 1 to 2, from 0 to 200, was all written in Hebrew. From 200 to 500, both the Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud, and the Babylonian Talmud, as well as the Midrash, is all written in Aramaic, or mostly Aramaic, right? So that seems to be the switch at that 200 mark-ish, give or take. I mean, none of this is exact. So the fact that a lot of this is written in Hebrew, in Aramaic, sort of indicates a later date. Now, could we argue that maybe the Hebrew sections were written earlier? It's possible. But we don't know. We don't know. All right. Any other questions? So next 2 weeks, we are going to dig into the text and start to look at some of the highlights. I definitely recommend, for those who are interested, over the course of the week, start to read. Look in Sefaria, look in your Tanakhs, read it, get a sense of what's going on. You'll get to see the flow of the visions. You'll see the chiasm much better if you actually now are looking for it and reading it through all those things, because we're going to just highlight different pieces of it. We're not going to go through the whole flow. All right, my friends, have a great week. And I will see you all, if not on Shabbat, next week.
Sounds good. Have a good night. Bye,
Bye, all.
everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so interesting.